projected plan, along with the consolidation of farms as marginal farmers left for the cities, as described a few moments ago. And fourthly, improved income distribution, related to the first three strategies, but complemented by more progressive taxation, notably by capture of rising land values via a valorization tax. The first priority was to ensure that urban families could enjoy far better housing. Hitherto, there have been three main types of housing and housing finance. Firstly, there was unlicensed, sprawling settlements with shelters built with poor quality materials. Financing was generally from households' personal savings plus their own work. These squatter settlements were usually on low cost, poorly located land that lacked basic services. But sometimes they were on vacant but valuable central city sites. Some of these were vacant for speculative reasons. Others were scheduled for intensive development with higher standards and higher rise buildings of a kind that could not be built by unskilled amateurs in the barrios de invasión. The second type consisted of licensed housing for the poor, with heavy subsidies from a state-owned institute with inadequate funds. These units were superior to those in squatter settlements, but still of low quality and on poorly located, hence low-value land. The third type was higher quality middle-income housing financed and built by a monopolistic central mortgage bank. This also enjoyed state subsidies. Subsidies strain the national budget. Both of these two institutions I've just mentioned, the one catering to lower income families and the central mortgage bank, which was catering to higher income families, raised much of their finance from tax-exempt bearer bonds, bonos al portador, that favored higher rate taxpayers because they were ones who would have paid otherwise high taxes. During the 1960s, inflation averaged 11%, but fluctuated wildly between 5% and 25%. Meanwhile, the interest on the bonds I've just mentioned was fixed at very low rates, and this deterred savers, so the government forced these bonds on pension funds and other institutions. The government needed to subsidize the low-cost housing institute because of large losses associated with delinquency among its low-income renters and purchasers. This compared with negligible delinquency at the central mortgage bank, the one catering to higher income groups. Because it had higher income customers, this institution could usually cover its costs. However, the average mortgage rate was 16%, and the maximum repayment period was only 10 years. These conditions greatly repressed mortgage demand because of the high rates that reflected high rates of interest, which reflected the high rate of inflation. The stifling of demand was matched by the slow growth of funds, and the institution's monopoly status, however, insulated it from competitive pressures to grow. All of this meant that the growth of both commercial and social housing was falling chronically short of the growth of new family units being formed. So the housing deficit steadily grew. The solution required long-term loans on affordable terms such that the growth of decent dwellings each year would exceed the growing need from the increased number of families newly formed. On the one hand, saving had to be made much more attractive, and on the other hand, demand had to match a greatly increased potential supply, which it was hoped would be forthcoming from these financial reforms. To convert housing into a leading sector required on the supply side mortgage institutions that would give savers safety, liquidity, and a competitive return in the financial markets. On the demand side, the borrowers needed mortgages on more affordable terms. The conundrum was resolved by focusing on the problem of inflation. The ideal would be to eliminate inflation. Then savers could get an attractive rate of interest, say 4%, but in both real and nominal terms. And then borrowers charge, say, 6% to give the institution a necessary commercialization margin between the cost of attracting funds versus the money they get from lending those funds. That would enable more families to buy a home compared to when inflation was 15%, say, and the interest rate 21%, to keep the real rate of interest at 6%. A nominal rate of 21% would give rise to a severe so-called cash flow or front-end loading problem for people borrowing 3 times their income and having to pay 21% interest in the first year. So this was what was severely stifling demand for housing. Unfortunately, Colombia has a poor record on inflation, although not as bad as some other Latin American countries. The problem is not merely that inflation has tended to be high on average. It is that high average rates of inflation tend to be accompanied by a great deal of volatility, ups and downs that cause great swings in the rate of interest, with major problems for potential borrowers. This is because the high inflation and the greater volatility of inflation rates in Latin America, including Colombia, plays havoc with the schedule of real payments for borrowers if lenders insist on variable interest rates. But if instead they have fixed rates of interest, they find themselves experiencing maybe a feast and a famine of mortgage funds available, because they have to compete with the flexible rates of interest in the shorter term financial markets, where there aren't the same problems as face long-term financing. So faced with this difficulty, Brazil and Chile had earlier introduced index-linked housing finance, indexación o corrección monetaria in Espanol. In 1972, Colombia went further than Brazil or Chile to make housing and related infrastructure investment a motor of accelerated development, while simultaneously maintaining the competitiveness of exports as a second motor of growth, ensuring that the exchange rate remained competitive despite whatever damage inflation might otherwise do to it. Of interest for China is that in both Colombia and Singapore, as we'll see, these two motors of growth were inherently complementary. Exports and housing and manufacturing and industrialization, inherently complementary, not in conflict with each other. For without adequate housing for its workers, the export sector and industrialization generally would face higher costs. By the same token, a more dynamic export sector would increase the incomes that can finance a bigger housing program, both because it generates more savings and because people can afford to borrow those savings to buy the houses that they can now afford that previously they may not have been able to. The important thing is that all this can be achieved without excessive recourse to the central bank's printing press. Now, the distinction between real and monetary demand is very significant for the housing finance market. If I can briefly digress on the importance of the distinction between non-inflationary finance that arises from savings out of real income versus inflationary finance that comes ultimately from the central bank without the support of real production. Unfortunately, in Colombia, the monetary authorities have often failed to understand this distinction between savings backed by real production out of real incomes on the one hand versus the printing press. Housing and other things financed just by printing money that's not backed by real production, and have allowed, as a result, the money supply to grow far too fast. The ideal is to foster rapid growth of savings, real savings, while applying strict brakes on growth of the money supply defined to exclude savings or time deposits. The distinction between demand and time deposits is critical. I've no time to elaborate, but suffice to say that in Singapore, in contrast to Colombia, there has been much clearer understanding of this distinction. There, in Singapore, the authorities have kept tight control over money while encouraging an incredibly fast growth of saving. As saving rates increased from 10% in 1965 to nearly 50% today, This has financed one of the world's fastest growing economies with the world's lowest rate of inflation. If Colombia could likewise eliminate high inflation, there'd be little need to index link its housing finance. Without going into details, the key point is that the new system of index-linked savings and loans, assets and liabilities of the new housing finance system, liberated the repressed demand for housing by eliminating this chronic so-called front-end loading problem for borrowers taking out mortgages. The upshot was that builders responded to the greater demand and the whole economy was pulled along behind. And this was the philosophy of housing as a leading sector in the economy. The new system had its critics, however. Existing banks hated the new competition, and the central bank tried to blame the new system for continuing inflation rather than admit their own failure to control the money supply. They argued instead that inflation was caused by increased savings and the building it financed, which is absurd. Others said that housing was unproductive without seeing the irony in their view that investment is productive if it's for the production of cement and bricks and glass and kitchen and bathroom fittings and high-speed lifts, etc. In fact, house building started to grow at well over 20% a year. This confirmed the hypothesis that savers and borrowers would respond to incentives and that private builders would likewise respond to increased profits from increased demand for the finished product, the house itself. Urban unemployment fell and GDP growth doubled to 7%. Good by Colombian standards, not by Chinese standards. Unfortunately, continuing inflation and the power of vested interests tended to dilute the system's dynamism through time. So there continues to be a growing housing deficit, and then the question arises, for whom should housing be built? The result of the mixed history I've just mentioned is that although the number of good quality middle-class housing has greatly increased and has transformed Colombia's cities, this type of housing has not kept pace with the even more rapid growth of new family formations. Therefore, a growing housing deficit has pressurized the government to rely increasingly on direct approaches to the crisis. That's to say, on direct subsidies for poor families. But subsidies strain the national budget and put pressure on the central bank to monetize fiscal deficits. This means the housing stock doesn't expand through real effective demand from savings, financed by savings, but instead through monetary inflation. It also means that rather than expanding middle-class housing ahead of the growth of new family formations, we build more and more actual or potential slums. If middle-income families must stay put in their existing homes rather than trading up, financed by a dynamic housing finance system, this means that poorer families are also prevented from trading up. And this goes all the way down to the very poorest groups. This brings us to consider not only the efficiency gains from rapid urbanization, but also the distribution of those gains. On the side of efficiency, we've already stressed the importance of greater mobility of labor and capital, so that workers can go to where their wages are higher and capital can go to where the returns are greatest. Mobility increases employment and puts a natural upward pressure on wages as the pool of surplus rural labor is absorbed by the expanding cities. But at the same time, this process of demographic shift to the cities comes up against a fixed supply of land.